it will go to Facebook. Everybody turn your phones off.
Oh, Naki, can you record
And where does it say record?
down on the bottom?
I'm under all this pressure right now, and we're live.
And we are live.
And we're
Good
live.
evening. It's Islander time, so 5 o'clock, 5:17. We're getting started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Koviki Talk. I'm your host, Carl. With me, your other host, Naki. What's up, Naki?
Hey,
We're ready to go?
we are ready to go.
All right.
I got to go ahead. Go ahead. I'm gonna hit live somewhere, record, but go ahead.
Okay. Koviki Talk is a podcast series that talks about our search for wisdom or research. If you haven't already figured it out, Koviki is the Pacifica word for COVID. So Koviki Talk is a 21 episode series of podcasts brought to you by the Pacific Islander Center of Primary Care Excellence. That's PICOPSI. We love PICOPSI. We will have doctors and researchers and doctors that are researchers and experts on each of the episodes to talk about where we are right now in terms of a vaccine, how Pacifica people can be involved, and what the future looks like. So the people involved in this podcast are what we would call the tip of the spear in Koviki research. You're not going to have more up to the minute timely information than you're going to find in our series as we go. So before we get to the real smart people
I
with
know.
initials behind their
Let's
names,
talk about
I'm
us.
going to introduce our your other host. Naki Fisomoli is the co-founder of Pali by Design. You've probably seen her running around town chasing after people with a microphone and a camera in tow. She serves as an on-air personality, an MC, a speaker, an event correspondent, and social media director for Pali by Design. She's a mother of 5, a cancer survivor, and an advocate for victims of sexual assault. Deeply rooted in the Samoan community and culture, she strives to build positive connections in an effort to lift her community up.
Well, there you go. And Carl.
Welcome, Naki.
Carl is the co-founder of Poly by Design and the FICA podcast. Carl does sound engineering, graphic, and web design, as well as partnering in the grant writing for Poly by Design. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice and is board certified in loss prevention, as well as holding industry certifications in forensic and kinetic interviewing. Carl is a husband, a father of triplets, a son, a brother, and is thriving with stage 4 cancer today. He devotes his time to helping elevate the standard of living for the Samoan and Pacific Islander communities.
Thank you, Naki. Now let's get to the doctors, our panelists. So I am going to introduce Dr. Andrew Young. He is a Samoan investigator at the biotechnology company Dren Bio, where he investigates the underlying cause of various diseases and uses this data to develop innovative and effective treatments. Dr. Young was born and raised in the village of Faleniu in American Samoa. He graduated from Tafuna High School and received his Bachelor's of Science in Molecular Biology from the University of New Mexico. His discovery of the function of a novel protein complex involved in intracellular communication led to several peer-reviewed publications and earned him a PhD in biological chemistry from UCLA. He then pursued an additional 4 years of research as a postdoctoral fellow at the biotech company Genentech, where he identified a novel gene that regulates inflammation in disease models of rheumatoid arthritis and skin allergy. Welcome, Dr. Young.
Aloha, Carl, Naki. Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Dr. Raynald Samoa. Dr. Raynald Samoa, MD, is a clinical research endocrinologist. He has a lifelong fascination with obesity-related disorders and has parlayed that interest into research projects investigating the metabolic conditions that affect populations vulnerable to diabetes, such as Pacific Islanders and cancer survivors. Dr. Raynald Samoa received his medical degree from the University of Washington. He did his adult endocrinology fellowship at the Los Angeles County University of Southern California and his pediatric endocrinology fellowship at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Dr. Samoa is the clinical lead for the National Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team. The team is comprised of 10 different regional task forces from around the country and includes states such as California, Washington, Hawaii, Arkansas, Utah, and Arizona. Currently, he is an assistant clinical professor at the City of Hope Medical Center in Duarte, California. Welcome, Dr. Samoa.
Thanks for having me. What a great way. All your scientific pronunciations right on the money.
Oh my gosh,
Ooh.
thank God. I was like,
Well, wait till we get done.
I was like,
Wait till we get done with the next one, because I have some good words to
know.
pronounce here. Our third panelist and third doctor is Dr. Nia Aita Otto. She is an associate professor at the University of Utah's College of Health and the lead consultant to the Pacific Islander Center of Primary Care Excellence, that's PICOPSI again, and the technical assistance lead for the Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team. She has a PhD in community and behavioral health from the University of Iowa, an MPH in community health development, and an MS in epidemiology, both from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Dr. Aitaoto is a principal and co-investigator of several research studies and has over 20 years of experience in the health and education field, focusing on cancer, diabetes, mental health, substance abuse, cultural competency, physical activity, nutrition, medication adherence, and tobacco-related initiatives. Dr. Aitaoto also specializes in providing technical assistance, data assessment, and evaluation support to ministries of health, community health centers, and nonprofit organizations in Hawaii, American Samoa, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, Republic of Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Welcome, Dr. Aita Otto.
Hi, thank you, Talofa.
Talofa, Nia. So Carl and I were always talking about, we were wondering, like when I Google how to suffocate your spouse, just saying, does the government see what I Google? Like, you know, like I'm just using that as an example.
Did you actually Google that?
No. I was just asking. Does anybody
Okay.
know? Okay. So the last thing that I Googled was a place to eat on Saturday, where because of COVID-19, not all restaurants are open and not all restaurants have dine-in. And so I was just wondering that. But Carl, what was the last thing that you Googled?
The last thing I Googled was actually how to be a moderator. Not for this particular show, not for this podcast, but we're looking to have a debate, a Trump-Biden debate for Pacific Islanders. And I volunteered myself to be the moderator, and then after they said yes, now I got to go figure out how to be a moderator. So that's what I Googled.
Yeah.
Dr. Ah Young, what was the last thing that you Googled?
The last thing that I Googled was I was looking for air purifiers. As you know, we're under fire here in California. So, but I think a couple of the models are already out of stock. So I might have to steal one or borrow one from someone.
How to find one on the black market will be your next Google.
Yeah. Right. Dr. Samoa, what was the last thing you Googled?
I had to, what I had to Google? Oh, I had to Google your grandniece. My daughter she's learning physics. So she's a freshman.
Awesome.
And I don't know how to speak to kids. So I had to Google like videos that explains physics concepts, like on a very elementary level or a very basic level, because one with cartoons, so that because physics is really difficult as it is, and to me it's a visual science. You know, you need to visually see physics to understand it, and so that's what I Googled.
Awesome.
So that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's our first example of how smart our panel is. He Googled physics to figure out how to explain it simply. Dr. Aitaoto, what was the last thing that you Googled?
how to install my camera. Literally, after I promised yesterday that we have a camera, yeah, I threw away the instructions, how to install it, typical Pacific Islander. And then I couldn't figure it out. So I have to Google the model and all that. And then, here I am.
Nice.
You
So we can
probably
hope that we're
YouTube it
all
instead of Googling it.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
a YouTube video for
There.
that.
we can hope that we're all successful in our Google, except Naki. Except Naki.
Yeah.
We want,
Hey,
we
I
want
was
Mo
just
around.
asking a simple, innocent
friend?
question. For a friend.
You asking
For
for a friend?
There you go.
Okay.
For a friend.
So, the reason we went through this, in essence, we're all researchers in our own lives, right? We call it Googling or look it up on the internet. Kids research information for term papers or essay topics. If you play fantasy football, you know that there's a ton of research to be done about who to put in your starting lineup each week. If you're shopping, you check to see what you need before you go to the store so that you get exactly what you need. That's research. And sometimes the word research brings up images of like textbooks and essays and all that, but we're all researchers in some way. So as we go through this podcast series, when we say research, just know that we're all researchers. When you think about our Pacifica ancestors researched seasons, change of seasons and currents and wind patterns and the movement of stars across the sky and the migration patterns of birds, all those things to help them navigate the vast Pacific. So research is in our DNA, and that is what our series is about. We're going to talk about researching COVID and how important those things are. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Young in terms of Koviki. Just what is the first part of the research for something like COVID?
So, as you mentioned, there are different types of research. Personally, for me, I'm more on sort of the basic and preclinical research. Currently, my research is not at the clinical stage yet. And once it gets to that stage, that's sort of where I believe the clinicians, so Raynald, Samoa, Ray would be in sort of that area. But for COVID, basic research is really about it's understanding sort of the basic biology, understanding what the virus is, what type of virus it is, how the virus infects, and so what kind of cells the virus infects. And there's a lot of valuable information from that because it allows us to, we'll know how the virus is transmitted. So it allows us to develop sort of prevention strategies. Is it in the air? Is it in liquid droplets? But also when it comes to drug development, right? And there's a lot of companies that are now in the race to find a vaccine or to find a treatment for COVID. And this is so basic research is critical because we want to develop a drug that is very specific, that knows exactly how to prevent the virus. And that's important because it prevents, it's important for safety, right? So you want a drug that's target specific, that's on the mark, and not cause, other adverse effects. And that's from the drug perspective. And there are many different creative ways one can develop a drug. And I think we have a series, I think it's our third podcast where we'll start going into sort of the details of the different types of drugs and clinical trials. But at my level, I'm really at the sort of basic research and preclinical. So the preclinical side of research is where, before you get into human testing, you want to make sure that the molecule works. You want to make sure that like I said, the drug hits the mark. So we can do a lot of these things outside of a human, outside of a person. So there are many different animal models. We can do it directly on cells. So, for the past couple of months, researchers have been doing a lot of these sort of basic and preclinical types of research. So now there are drugs that are now in human trials. So now it's at the clinical stage. And once it passes that, then it can get out to the wider community.
We're already getting questions from Facebook. One of the questions is, there are close to 500 stranded residents of American Samoa. We saw the Hawaii Department of Health in their percent positive, which is currently 2.2%. What would you recommend would be a feasible plan for repatriation of its own citizens back home? And could you offer a timeline? And I guess that would be from a clinical or from a medical standpoint, what would repatriation look like, and a timeline? Because you're not the governor, so you're not able to open up the territory. And that's to any of the doctors on the panel.
Well, so most of the standard travel quarantines is about 2 weeks. So if anybody who lands in American Samoa currently, I believe, has to be quarantined for 2 weeks to see if they demonstrate any visible symptoms. And so, I would hope that the plan would involve testing before they travel to reduce the risk of exposure to the flight crew, but also decrease the risk of bringing it back home. And then, carrying out that quarantine policy once they arrive in American Samoa. So the hiccups would be the coordination on Hawaii side, who would do the testing, how soon do you do it before they fly? Because testing can take anywhere from, depending on which test you use, can take anywhere from 4 hours to 7 days. So, I think right now, I don't know what's the most popular test they're using in Hawaii, but most of the states, the turnaround time is about 2 to 3 days. So, even if you test someone, you got 2 days of someone, still being able to contract it before they fly. And if it's longer, the longer the wait time, the higher the risk of contracting it before you fly off. So the most important part of that is what they do on American Samoa side, which is quarantine, make sure they're not demonstrating symptoms. And for the most part, that seems to have worked. Now, Nia is queen of the U.S. Pacific, so I'll let her speak to what the challenges are down there.
Yeah, I think they're well prepared, not just American Samoa, but other U.S. jurisdictions, to accept people to come back in, because I know what it's like to feel like you want to go home. But safety is their primary concern. So yeah, everything that you said is correct and right on point. But very carefully, because we don't want, our people to be exposed and all that. But, quarantine, follow the science, make sure. And that's the hardest thing too, right? Is to quarantine people on island because, there's somebody that want to hug auntie and sneak into the, quarantine place. So make sure everybody understand, and that's behavioral. We understand that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think, I've been following American Samoa's strategy, and they've been building spaces for quarantine. And what Ray mentioned, 2 weeks is standard, and that's really critical because, from the point of infection, right, the first week is really where you start to see this boost in viral load. And I think that's, the first 2 weeks is really the point where you're really infectious. So you're at high risk of infecting other people. And then beyond that, you become, your viral load drops, so it reduces the risk of infection. So really, and also testing. Like testing, there are different types of tests, and different tests have different sensitivities, right? There are very sensitive tests that will say that you're positive, but this would be the PCR test, and this can detect really low levels, right? Even a point where you're not infectious.
Right.
And like antibody tests, these are not as sensitive, but when they do indicate that you're positive, it really means that you have to reach a very high load to get a positive test. So those are the tests that would indicate that, okay, there's a lot of virus in this person. You are likely infectious and stay quarantined. So I think as long as the quarantining is in place, I don't see why this, why we should continue to lock, to prevent people from going back home. But again, I think if the precautions are in place, then you don't have to have flights every week, right? I think there are groups online that have also proposed, bi-weekly, every 2 weeks you would have a flight so that people can adjust on quarantine. So there's also they don't run out of space as well.
Makes sense. Dr. Aitaoto, can you explain, it's a big word, and Naki and I practiced it over and over before we got on here, what epidemiology is and why the research is important? Because the next question that we're going to ask is, why does research matter? So what is epidemiology? We hear that being spoken about a lot. And what are some of the studies that are being done, public studies that are being done in relation to COVID?
Wow, we're gonna hit it up right on. So epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states and events like COVID-19. So now you're thinking, what does that mean? So let's just start looking at health states and health-related states and events. So it can be anything from COVID-19, hepatitis B, those are all infectious, all the way to like diabetes and non-communicable disease like diabetes and hypertension. And then it also can be issues around maternal child health, like being pregnant, raising children, all that kind of stuff, right? Because that's not a disease, but it is a health-related state or event, state of being pregnant and all that kind of stuff. So when it comes to COVID-19, the question epidemiologist, I said the word distribution, right? So the question is, and our population is the United States, if we define it as such. Does everybody in the United States, bear the burden of COVID-19, infection and death and stuff like that equally, right? Or there's some people who have higher rates of death and infection and lower, for example, older people versus younger people, poor versus rich, male, female, and all that kind of stuff. So epidemiology look at that kind of data. I also look at where you live, your zip code is just as important or even much more important than your genetic code, right? It finds a lot of that social determinants and things like that. So we look at things like that. And we also look at determinants. So for example, what causes COVID-19? We all know it's a virus, but we also look at risk factor. What will increase your risk or decrease your risk of not only catching COVID-19, but also die from COVID-19, right? Those are two different things, because you can get COVID-19, but some people, their rates is much higher, or certain groups and things like that. So that's what we do, for public health. So that's pretty much public health research and things like that. But COVID-19 is such a new, it's a new disease, right? So we don't know a lot about COVID-19. But at the same time, we know a lot about infectious disease, right? We also know a lot of the gaps and everything that goes around with it. So doing research in COVID-19 is very important because it's a new condition. So the good thing about doing these podcasts, 21 episodes, is that we're going to bring in other experts, to come in and talk about their field, their research, and their knowledge. They're all new. So a lot of this, what we're going to talk about today, and then the 21 episode, is all new to us. But that's pretty much what epidemiology research is.
Thank you. One of the things that we want to make sure that we talk about on this episode is what do people need to know if they want to sign up to participate in a study. So I want to get into why the research matters first, and then I do want to spend some time on how do we get involved. If people want to be part of the study, if Pacific Islanders want to be part of the study, how do we get involved? So Dr. Samoa, if you can give us some, when you say why does research matter, Why does it matter so much in particular with COVID?
So what a lot of people don't understand is that research is the driver, you know. So the way things work is in communities is, you know, there's what we call data. So data is information that there's a health concern in the community, right, or in the population, if you will. So that health concern then justifies people saying, hey, we need to put money into treating this condition, this concern. So then you get this money going into programming. And then the programs go into treating the health concern, which then gets reevaluated as data. So you can see how without that, without that particular piece of information, nothing else moves. You know, so what Nia was talking about with epidemiology, that research is what justifies who gets money to get the programs to help treat COVID. And for the longest time, we didn't have it. We had sort of broad information like we know that the rates in Pacific Islanders are high in California. California is a big state. We don't know where to put any resources in if we don't have any information about the particular counties and neighborhoods. And so it takes more research to figure out what those numbers are. Same thing when it comes to how the virus affects our people. There's so many things about what's making this virus go that we didn't know in the beginning. We didn't know in the beginning in March that COVID-19 follows disparity. That it follows communities of color. That took research. I think the article broke in May in the Journal of American Medical Association. I think it was I'm going to mess up his name. I want to say it was, it's Yancey. So Dr. Yancey wrote about COVID-19 and African Americans, and all of a sudden everybody started talking about how it's affecting communities of color. Our communities know it. We know when there's a particularly high number of funerals in our population, but that doesn't always translate to the people who are responsible for giving us the resources to help fight COVID-19. And so all of these are results of research, and so that's why it's particularly important for us to engage. And we'll talk about some of the pitfalls that we had, with research and how we're a little bit smarter this time and what things we can do to protect ourselves. But it is a crucial part of getting over any health concern. And so that's why it's important.
And this goes to anyone who wants to answer, any of the doctors. When research is done with animals, does it translate to humans? Is the immune response the same in animals, the immune response of vaccines in animal models?
I think it's, there are different animal models. Monkeys is when, this is also still sort of preclinical stage, but that's more translatable than, say, a lot of the work that I'm doing is done in mice. And so in non-primate models, so in mice, it's a similar immune system, right? So it allows you to sort of understand the different pathways that are involved. So for COVID-19, first it infects sort of the epithelial cells of the lungs, and then that induces sort of an immune response. And this is how it happens in humans, and the same is true for mice as well. So it's a way to give you a sense of what to expect or what to anticipate when we do go into doing clinical studies, so human trials. There's, you know, we learn a lot from sort of the basic fundamental aspects of science from these animal models. And that's, you know, that also helps for screening purposes, right? You can have like 20 drugs. You're not going to test all 20 in humans. So you do screens in animals and other cell-based studies to find the one that is most effective. And so it narrows it down, and then we can go to the next stage and test it in monkeys and see if it's safe. And then we keep going until we get to sort of the clinical level.
So they're kind of rushing this because of the pandemic, right? So are they bypassing testing it on animals, or does that even do they do that? Test it on animals first and then on humans, or are they bypassing that and just going straight to humans?
So not that I know of, they're not bypassing sort of the preclinical. There's, if anything, it's really fast paced. There's a lot of sort of multi-company collaborations that are going on right now. So, you know, one company would be screening on animals and other ones are, you know, manufacturing. So there's manufacturing that's going on at the same time before the drug is actually being approved. And this is part of this Operation Warp Speed. And the whole idea behind this is that there's no delay in getting the drug out, right? And it's you know, it's also an economical risk, right? There's a lot of money putting into these drugs, and if it doesn't work in the clinic, then it's a waste, right? But if it does work, then there's no waiting period to manufacturing these drugs. So to your question, I don't think there's companies are bypassing any of these steps. It's more accelerating, but still well controlled studies.
Okay, got it.
But it's the handoff. So although we're researchers,
Right.
Pati, Nia, and I, we don't overlap much. We have very different skill sets. Like, so well, what Pati's talking about is the earliest research done on a vaccine is done at the cellular level. So they take cells and they put it in a dish and they do their testing in that. After that, it moves to an animal model. After the animal model seems like it doesn't seem to be too dangerous, then it moves to human clinical trials. After it's done through human clinical trials, it goes through sort of widespread public health evaluation. So that's from going to what Paki does in the bench, you know, or sorry, what he does in the laboratory is what we call bench research. So when it comes over to me and other physician researchers, it's called translational research, because we translate what's being done at the bench into humans, you know. And so usually that process takes about 10 years. We did it in 6 months. So there's some concern, and there's very well should be, but we'll talk about that in later. And then, like I said, once we do human trials and we show that something might be effective, it takes somebody like Nia with her skill set to see how do we get to do this more effectively. Like, just because you have something available, it doesn't mean a community is going to use it. So you need that aspect of research to make sure that people are fully optimizing therapy, right? Or else you're going to get like the measles. Remember the measles outbreak in Samoa?
Yes.
Was that you had a therapy, you had a treatment, a preventative treatment that wasn't being utilized, and you needed people to understand human behavior and public health to make it so that these therapies were being used.
So, and because we all know that, I'm sorry, Carl, the numbers for PIs are like off the chart, that it's so high. Would it be recommended for PIs to apply? I guess that's the word I'm looking for, for the vaccine, you know, testing the vaccine? And if so, like, do they not have, you know, you can't be diabetic, you shouldn't be, like, what are the do nots you shouldn't have? Or is there?
There is. So with effectiveness and phase 3 trials, they're looking to see how well the immune response in humans comes about from the vaccine, right? So there is still a little bit of a safety. There's safety always throughout in these clinical trials. So safety evaluations are constantly being done. But because these agents are relatively new, they're truncating the usual time it takes for us to really to understand if there's any side effects. So they're starting with a healthy cohort first. So that means no diabetes, no cancer. You know, there's probably some other eligibility criteria that revolves around whether or not you have a chronic condition. And that's because for the most part, we don't know, you know, there's still a lot to be learned about the safety profile in these vaccines.
Right, right.
I think just to add to that, I think it also, you know, depending on pre-existing conditions, that could also confound the results of the trial, right? So, you know, recently the AstraZeneca, so one of the companies that's currently in phase 3, had to halt temporarily because one of the volunteers had responded, had an adverse effect, which apparently the trial has now proceeded, but it was not due to the vaccine that was tested. So I believe there was a pre-existing condition of some sort. So I think, you know, phase 1 is really testing the safety of the formulation of the drug itself. Do you get any adverse effects from that? As Ray mentioned, you know, there's always safety monitoring throughout the trials. So I think it's just different clinical trials will have different regulations for tests.
Thank you, Doctor.
I was listening to a podcast with Dr. Plotkin, I think, from he helped with the rubella vaccine, and he was talking about the cost it has to get a drug to market, to get a vaccine to market. The Trump administration has started Operation Warp Speed, which I'm hearing puts a lot of, like Dr. Samoa was talking about, having a healthy cohort. But has that really sped up everything because there's more money, or how does that help the process because there's more money available? Is that speeding the process along because multiple trials are able to be done simultaneously, or is that a concern from it's going to muddy the waters, like we may get a something to market too fast, I guess, kind of along Naki's question. We're not skipping any steps. I guess that's the question.
I think there's definitely, you know, the grants from the government is definitely providing an incentive for companies, even companies who never worked on vaccine development. Now they're all participating in this, right? And that's coming from, you know, the funding aspect of it, plus the trials are also accelerated, so it gives, you know, like startup companies, if they get something through to the market, there are definitely accelerated guidelines, so it gives those companies, you know, credibility as well in terms of what they can provide, what technology they have. But again, I don't think there's any cutting corners, at least from what I've been following. And I think the FDA is still very strict in regards to evaluating the data that's coming out. And if it's less than 50% effective, you know, that's not going to go out into the market. Yeah, but I think but there's also the, you know, the humanitarian aspect of it, right? A lot of companies or academic labs, the NIH as well, you know, all these scientists some scientists have even started companies just to participate in this and, you know, play a role in helping eliminate COVID. So I would say the money helps, but also just the civic duty, I think, also comes into play here.
So this question is for any of the panelists. If I wanted to, well, anybody wanted to get involved in the clinical trials, how would they do that? And like Dr. Samoa had talked about, like there's different cohorts, right? There's the without risk, I guess the healthy cohort. I would assume that there's opportunity for different types of health conditions to participate in the trials. How would one go about getting involved with that, or is it possible to get involved with that?
Well, there's a couple of different ways. There's some advertising going around about a couple clinical trials that are being, you know, they're recruiting right now. You know, these vaccination trials are kind of popping up all over the place. I think there was everyone, you know, the Pfizer one is on hold right now because they've had sort of an increased risk of side effects reported. So I don't know if they've resumed recruiting. There's other ones, and I'm sure Paki knows those that are currently recruiting as well. So there is a lot of that going around. But before we get there, you know, one of the things that people don't really get is they get very surprised when they call someone or they call a research trial, and you know, they think, oh, it's a vaccine trial. I just go, I get a shot, and I come out. It's actually a very involved process, you know, because there's all these checks to make sure that you're not going to be harmed by the vaccine in any way, or at least minimize harm. So there's all these safeguards in place because, you know, the U.S. is one, you know, is one of those countries that we did a lot of research back in the day without consent, and it caused a lot of harm to individuals and communities. And so the National Institute of Health and a lot of the academic bodies surrounding research realized that this is not an appropriate way to conduct research. So they've set all these guidelines for researchers to put in place to help protect subjects when they're participating. So I don't know anybody who's recruited more Pacific Islanders in studies and had to do more in regards to explaining content and the process than our own Dr. Aitaoto.
Yes.
And so I think we can learn a lot from her sort of explaining how the research process works.
Yeah, and I think podcast 3 will go over all the questions, right? So if you want to participate in a clinical trial, we'll go over what it is, you know, the question that they need to answer, you know, kind of question that you need to ask before you sign up, because there are a lot of benefit of participating, but there's also a lot of things that you need to be aware of, you know, that to get answers. So we're not saying, you know, participate or don't participate. What we're saying is get yourself educated, right? Get the questions in place and then ask them, you know, will this, because some trials will have placebo effect, you know what I mean? They're not going to give you the vaccine, right? So, and then, but you're not going to find out, right? So all of that, are you okay with that, right? Are you okay participating knowing that you may not get the medicine, you'll get the water, whatever else. So all those questions. So I think that's why we designed it this way, where we're going to have a specific podcast just on that. We're going to talk about vaccine development, but also protecting human subject, which is us, right? What kind of stuff we can do to protect ourselves. And then also we'll introduce you to other researchers. You can actually, instead of you like, instead of you Google, things like that, right? You will know another Pacific Islander researcher that you can email and ask questions, because, it's part of our civic duty, as Pati was saying, duty to our community, right? To make sure that we're available to answer your questions. So yeah, thank you, Samoa, for the commercial opportunity.
Because, there's something
Yeah,
to be
and I
said
think
there's something
yeah,
to be
just
said
to,
about the fact that you have three of us, that you have, there's more of us,
Right.
and that our understanding of research, the three of us have been through the fire of academia.
Mhm.
So we understand the academic perspective of research. But what makes us sort of change the field of research is all the culture and our perspective that we come in with it. So it's extremely important that we keep doing that, and that if you're interested in science, if you're interested in social science, that you pursue it, because this is how we advance. Because you know, trying to, if we wait for like these academic institutions to demonstrate some benevolence and just look at our conditions, that's not how it works. We have to constantly push for our issues to be evaluated and ensure that they're studied with integrity, and that's how we progress from health. Sorry, Pati, you're saying?
or no, I was just gonna add that if you know, episode 3 is where we'll go into the details of the clinical trials, but we'll also touch on the science itself, right? So one of the goals of the series is to destigmatize research, right? There's a lot of fear associated with research, right? So we'll break down the drug development aspect, that it's vaccine research is, there's nothing scary about it. It's relatively safe, and that's the purpose of all of these trials, to ensure that safety is met. And another thing I wanted to add is the clinical trials that are currently recruiting, right? Some of these trials have specific sites. So you may be, so in the in the Bay Area, the closest site to me is Sacramento, right? So I'd have to go there, and it depends, depending on the design of the trial, you may have to go get, a second dose. So there are a lot of these things that have to factor into. So if you're in the, middle of nowhere, right? Like some states don't have sites, right? So it's something that you have to get the details, plan for if you really want to participate. And there's a whole, when you sign up, there's a survey to also select who would qualify for the trials.
There's I remember in our notes there's an actual office, right? There's a department for human research protection. Is that specifically or more specifically for clinical trials, or what is that? That's protecting human research subjects. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the Office for Human Research Protection, and I think this is part of the National Institute of Health, and any research that involves human subjects, and this is basically clinical trials. This is the department that ensures that the rights of people are protected, the welfare, the well-being of the subjects are all supported, and they also enforce policies regarding how trials are designed. And I don't know if they also play a part in terms of ensuring that these trials include different demographics, different minority populations. That I'm not sure of, but certainly I know for the Moderna clinical trial, there is promotion of signing up at-risk communities like Pacific Islander communities to join in these studies.
Is it important for Pacific Islanders because we are at higher risk with COVID-19, a novel virus? Is it important for us to become part of the clinical trials and be represented in the trials in case there's something down the road? Is it important for us to be included in the research from the standpoint of our genealogy being represented or our DNA?
Very much so. Because there's some nuances sometimes with different ethnic and racial groups in regards to efficacy of medications and treatment plans. And so you don't know how effective it is unless it's used in someone that's closer to sort of your biological makeup. And so that information is important. Just as important is that we develop clinical trials, that we do our own research as well. One of the projects we're working on is trying to figure out what is the big impetus behind ignoring such a tough word, not adhering to some of the practices that help reduce spread. Like what are some of the things that are causing us to leave the house or still gather or not practice social distancing? Is it economic? Is it cultural? Is it psychological? Those things we still have to pull out. And I will tell you, no one's going to do it but us, and no one's going to do it as well as us. So it is imperative that we not only sit on these discussions in regards to vaccinations and treatment plans, but that we also lead our own trials to help increase the knowledge around COVID to help us fight it. Pati, there was a question in the chat in regards to your choice of the word drug, but I think you were referring to the vaccine, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So a vaccine is
What's
a
the
drug.
question?
Don't forget.
Vaccine,
Yeah, people
and
tend
also
to.
You were like, what drug? What drug? Calm down, people.
or
Not
Gets
hydroxychloroquine.
shot into you, your mouth. That's a drug.
but yeah, also to add to what Ray said, part of these clinical trials, it's also to learn if it's working on certain people and not working on others, right? Then that's a green light that we need to go back to the basic research and start again and look at the data from the clinical trial and look at what ways what can we change such that we can capture everyone, that we can treat everyone. And so, and we're, like Ray said, we're different genetically. So drugs your genetics can dictate your response to a vaccine or to a drug. So the more involvement from Pacific Islanders, and we're grossly underrepresented in many studies, many research, many clinical studies. So the more involved we are, our data can help improve future drugs, right? And the more of us who are represented in making those decisions, being being on the bench or on the clinical side, it allows us to change how the studies are designed such that we're incorporated. And in doing so, we increase the chance of developing something that would be effective for us.
Awesome. Is there anything, well, what I got out of that is that what might work for one ethnicity or group may not necessarily work for us, but we don't know unless we get in there, right?
Right. And I have an example on the measles vaccine, right? So because we did have a epidemic in the Northern Pacific, and then also here I'm based in Arkansas right now. So we had a lot of children were getting measles, and then the health department thought that they were not immunized, and then they were able to provide the immunization card, they were immunized and all that stuff. And then the health department, not just here but in other areas including the Pacific, thought, oh, maybe they got the patch was, the vaccine was not expired, and all that kind of stuff. And then when they did the research, it wasn't, right? So there's been this community, right? So talk about the community talking about measles, like maybe the vaccine doesn't work, but maybe the question is, maybe it doesn't work for us. So let's just check to see if they test the vaccine on, Pacific Islander back in the day, right? And, it's that vaccine has been around for a while. So, I could pretty much guess, how many Pacific Islander were involved there. So that's an example on how, and maybe we need an extra dose or something like that. So that's on the community level, that's a discussion on a community level, but we're trying to figure out then how to get it to the next level, right? So should we do tests on, measles and Pacific Islander to see, do we need a second dose, beyond, what's recommended,
Right.
and all that. So I think that's the health condition where, at this point we're talking about that, what we're talking about COVID-19. So I think that's one of the reasons why the three of us were motivated to do this, these type of podcasts, is that we want to bring awareness on the importance of why us Pacific Islander need to be involved in clinical trial, but also how can we understand what it is so we can make informed decisions and consent, knowing what are the risks, right? That's another thing, right? We haven't talked about risk. But being alive, you're at risk of death. You know what I mean?
Right.
Just by sitting here, I'm at risk, and that kind of stuff. So it's a great, it'll make a great conversation, later on. And that's another commercial coming up, right? So people that are listening, if you, have other questions, let us know, because we can bring in guests that can answer your question. So the good thing about where we're at as Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders is that we have a lot more health professionals out there than 10 years ago. So we will bring them in.
We got a really important question coming in from the Facebook chat. So it's for any of the three doctors. How's personal information protected? When you're signing up for a clinical trial and your medical information is given to these third-party clinics for the information, is the information protected from, say, insurance companies? So it's like HIPAA and those things, the confidentiality statements, those kind of things, those all apply. Is that correct?
Yes, even the type of research that I do, survey, focus group, all that kind of stuff. We sign a thing that you cannot, reveal names or any other personal information and that kind of stuff. So they're very strict about that. They're very strict about, keeping your information, safe. So, and even if I record something in a focus group, something like, do a focus group and record it so we can, write the notes later on, we have to make sure there's a plan for us to destroy that, no names are given and all that kind of stuff. So if that's strict on that kind, type of research that I do, I know is 100 times more strict, right? On Pati's side of research. And, Raynald, clinical research, so.
Yeah, so there's usually a couple forms you fill out when you give consent. One is like explanation of your risk that you're going to partake when you participate in the study. And that's usually the main informed consent. But the form right after that is a form talking about how your health information is going to be protected, but who has access to your information. So you want to try to give some time to read that, because like I said, because a lot of these are international collaborations.
Mhm.
You know, you want to take a good strong look to make sure you know who has access to your information just in case, right? For the most part, a lot of these are coming through the NIH. So, you know, if they do have to share it with anyone else, a lot of your information is de-identified. But you still, you know, should do your due diligence and see, and always take a copy. They, you know, you're supposed to get a
Always.
copy of your informed consent and your HIPAA. So always take that and keep it in a safe place.
And so from the NHPI data with COVID-19, it shows a high percentage among Pacific Islanders. Is there a way to disaggregate this data? Who do we contact for the specific request? I think we
Disaggregate data. So the NHPI data lab is housed at the UCLA Center for Health and Policy, Public Health and Policy. Um, Tavai, do you mind? We can put this in the description. The link to their site so that you can see the dashboard. This disaggregated data, we can spend a week,
on
we can
that.
spend a
Right.
whole conference on the problems we have with disaggregation. COVID-19 has been one of the few times there's been data available real time for Pacific Islanders.
Right.
And so it's Hawaii is the only place that further disaggregates Pacific Islander ethnicities. And in a lot of states, there is no NHPI data reported.
Right.
And so it depends on the state and the county as to what's being reported. But in almost every state that we look at that has NHPI disaggregated data, and when I mean disaggregated, meaning that we're not included with Asians, Pacific Islanders have like the highest rates or one of the highest rates. So that's a pretty consistent trend throughout the US.
Right. Which makes it really important to fill out that census 2020. Let me
Oh,
tell you.
speaking of which, what's the topic of next week's?
Yeah.
What a great segue, Naki. It just happens to be episode 2 of our 21 episode series is Census 2020. And the disaggregation and the separation of data and the identification of minorities, ethnic groups, those kind of things, that all fits under that umbrella. Like, we got to get counted. We'll go into that on our next episode. I'd like to thank the doctors for spending the time with us today. We started late, we're ending late. That's a good thing. Is there anything that either of you had the point that you came in with that you haven't been able to get across yet?
Right.
I think,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, I said what I wanted to say, but
Good.
just a reminder, you know, I think Ray and I are coming back again on the 3rd episode.
Yes.
So tune back in. We'll discuss drug
vaccines.
development, clinical trials, and yeah, if you have questions.
There is a request in
Go ahead and
the chat for contact information. I don't know how the best way to get that out is. We'll figure that out and we'll get it out.
Yeah. They're wanting to get a hold of the doctors, but most important that I got out of this is that every day everyone is doing research, whether you're Googling or checking to see what kind of move this is on a fight or what team is playing where, what the weather is. If you're looking to see what the weather is, that itself is research, really. So we want to thank the doctors. Oh, yes. Okay. That was for a friend. But we wanted to, that was for a friend. But thank you so much for your time. We know how valuable your time is. You know, we appreciate that you coming on, Dr. Young. Nia, Raynald, everyone for tuning in. Thank you everyone who tuned in. There's tons of questions. So come back next week and the week after. We're going to be answering your questions. Census 2020 is so important, especially Pacific Islanders were way undercounted in 2010. So we're missing out on resources and just all kinds of benefits and just everything. So come back next week, get more information on Census 2020. We'll be here every Monday at 5 p.m. Koviki Talk. Thank you for tuning in.
Bye.
Thank you.